A suitcase hit the pavement. The handle snapped clean off. A woman dropped to her knees on a sidewalk, gathering scattered clothes with shaking hands while strangers stepped around her. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked down. She was 61 years old, and 4 weeks ago she had a home, a kitchen, a bed she'd slept in for 3 decades. Now she was kneeling on concrete outside a bus station with nowhere to go. Her name was Lorraine Caldwell. People who knew her called her Rainey, but the people walking past her that morning didn't know her at all. They didn't see her. She'd become the kind of person that other people's eyes slid right over like a crack in the sidewalk or a stain on the wall. Something you register but don't really see. If you had walked past her that morning, you would have done the same thing. That's the truth of it. She looked like nobody. She looked like nothing. But what Rainey found 6 days later, at the end of a dirt path in the woods outside of town, most people had forgotten, changed everything. Not just for her, for those who thought they'd buried that cabin's secrets forever. Stay with me on this one. Now, to understand how a woman who spent 35 years building a life ended up on her knees outside a bus station, you need to understand a few things about Lorraine Caldwell. Not her whole history, not where she grew up, or what her childhood was like. None of that matters right now. What matters is this. For 3.5 decades, Rainey was the kind of woman who held everything together without anyone noticing she was doing it. Her husband, Gerald, ran a small printing business in the town of Millbrook, West Virginia. It wasn't a big operation, 3 employees at its peak, one press that broke down every other month, a front office that smelled like ink and old paper. But it put food on the table. It kept a roof over their heads. And it gave Gerald the kind of quiet pride that came from owning something with his name on the sign. Rainey, though, Rainey was the one who actually made it all work. She managed the books when the accountant quit, and Gerald couldn't afford to hire another one. She answered the phone when clients called, writing down orders in a notebook she kept in the top drawer of the kitchen counter because there was no desk for her at the shop. She packed school lunches for their 2 children, Mitchell and Colleen, at 5 in the morning before walking to the shop to open up, because Gerald liked to sleep until 7. She painted the front room of their house twice because the first time the color wasn't right and Gerald didn't want to pay someone to redo it. She hosted his family during holidays. Cooked for 12, smiled through the noise, cleaned up after everyone left, and never once asked for help. Not because she didn't need it, because she'd learned early on that asking didn't change anything. Believe me when I tell you, Rainey wasn't a saint. She wasn't some kind of suffering angel who never complained. She complained plenty. She told Gerald when she was tired. She told him when she thought he was being careless with money. She told him when his brother Clayton came around asking for loans he'd never repay. But she said all of that behind closed doors, in the kitchen, after the kids were in bed, because that's what women of her generation did. They fought their battles quietly in small rooms with no audience. And then they woke up the next morning and did it all over again. And for a long time, that life worked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. But it was hers. She knew the butcher at the grocery store by name. She knew which neighbor's dog barked at 3 in the morning and which one barked at 5. She knew the exact spot on the kitchen counter where the tile was cracked and you had to be careful setting down a glass. She knew what Gerald wanted for dinner on Thursdays, which was always meatloaf with mashed potatoes and extra gravy. And she knew that he'd fall asleep in front of the television by 9, and she'd have to wake him up and guide him to bed like a child. 35 years of knowing things like that. 35 years of being rooted in one place and one life, in one routine that never changed. Then Gerald died. It happened on a Tuesday. He'd been complaining about chest pains for 2 days, but he didn't want to go to the doctor because he said it was just gas. That's what he always said. Everything was gas. A headache was gas. A sore back was gas. Rainey had told him to go. She'd told him twice. She'd even called the clinic and made an appointment for him. He canceled it, waved her off, said he'd go next week. Next week came 2 days early. On Tuesday morning, Gerald went to the shop, sat down at his desk, and his heart stopped. Just like that. No warning, no dramatic collapse. The man who'd been next to her every single day for 35 years was gone between one breath and the next. An employee named Frank found him slumped over a stack of invoices. By the time Rainey got to the hospital, there was nothing left to do but paperwork. They handed her a form. She signed it. They handed her his watch and his wallet. She took them. They asked if she had questions. She didn't. The funeral happened 3 days later. Gerald's family came from all over. His brother Clayton drove down from the city with his wife Barbara and their 2 grown sons. Everyone wore black. Everyone brought food. Everyone said the right things. He was a good man. He's at peace now. Be strong, Rainey. Nobody said the thing that was actually true, which was that Gerald had been a decent man who'd made some bad decisions with money and left his wife in a situation she didn't yet understand. Rainey moved through the funeral like she was watching herself from across the room. She thanked people she barely knew. She accepted condolences from neighbors who'd never spoken to her in 30 years. She poured coffee for Clayton's wife Barbara, even though Barbara had never once poured coffee for her. That's who Rainey was. Even in the worst moment of her life, she poured the coffee. She arranged the food on plates. She made sure there were enough chairs, because if she stopped moving, she'd have to feel what was happening. And she wasn't ready for that. The trouble started 11 days after the funeral. Rainey was sitting at the kitchen table going through Gerald's papers. She had a system. Bills in one pile, bank statements in another, insurance documents in a third. The mess was bigger than she'd expected. Gerald had not been organized. There were envelopes stuffed with receipts handwritten "I owe us" and at least 2 credit card statements she'd never seen before. That's when Clayton showed up at the door. He didn't knock. He walked in, sat down across from her, and put a manila folder on the table. Inside was a copy of the deed to the house. Rainey looked at it and felt something cold slide through her chest. The house was not in her name. It had never been in her name. It was registered to the Caldwell Family Trust, a legal structure Gerald's father had set up decades ago to keep property within the family and avoid certain taxes. Gerald had told Rainey the house was theirs. He'd told her that dozens of times over the years. "This is our house, Rainey." But on paper, the house belonged to the trust, and the trust was controlled by the eldest surviving male in the family. That was Clayton. Now here's the thing. Clayton wasn't a cruel man. Not exactly. He was worse than cruel. He was practical. He was the kind of man who could look you in the eye and deliver devastating news in a calm, reasonable voice and genuinely believe he was being helpful. He sat across from Rainey with his hands folded and explained that the house needed to be sold. The printing business had debts. Gerald had taken loans that Rainey didn't know about. 3 of them. 2 from the bank and 1 from a private lender who was already calling. The equipment at the shop was outdated and nearly worthless. The clients had already started going elsewhere. The only asset of real value was the house, and it needed to be liquidated to settle the family's obligations. He said the family's obligations, like it was a phrase he'd rehearsed in the car on the way over. Rainey asked him what she was supposed to do, where she was supposed to go. Clayton didn't quite meet her eyes. He said she could stay with her son Mitchell. He said it like it was a solution, like it was simple. Mitchell lived 600 miles away in a 2-bedroom apartment with his wife and their baby. Rainey hadn't even told Mitchell about the house situation yet. She'd been trying to figure it out herself first. She'd been trying to protect her son from the same helplessness she was feeling. She called a lawyer the next morning. The lawyer was sympathetic. He listened to everything, took notes, and then gave her the same news she already knew but didn't want to hear. Legally, the trust document was clear. The house was not hers. She could contest it in court, but it would take years and cost money she didn't have. She could claim a right of residence under certain state laws, but Clayton had already filed papers to dissolve the trust and sell the property. He'd been moving fast, faster than grief. The lawyer told her she had maybe 60 days before the eviction proceedings would start. He charged her $3,000 for this information, and she paid it because she didn't know what else to do. Rainey spent the next 2 weeks on the phone. She called Mitchell, who was upset but helpless. He was working 12-hour days at a tech company and barely keeping up with his own rent. He said she could come stay, but the strain in his voice was obvious. His wife was in the background, quiet, not hostile, just quiet. The quiet of a woman who was doing the math on a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 adults and a baby. Rainey heard that quiet and understood it perfectly. She called Colleen, her daughter, who lived abroad, and cried on the phone and promised to send money. The money came, a few $1,000s. Rainey was grateful, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for a legal fight or a security deposit on an apartment or anything that resembled a solution. She called old friends, most of whom expressed sympathy and offered nothing concrete. One friend said she'd ask around. Another said Rainey could stay for a few days if she needed to. A few days. That was the maximum anyone was willing to commit. Rainey didn't blame them. She understood. Nobody wants to be the person who takes in the widow. It starts as a few days and it never ends. She called the local women's shelter, which gave her a list of other shelters and a phone number for legal aid that rang and nobody answered. She called the county housing office and was told there was a waiting list that was 3 years long. She called Clayton one more time and asked if there was any other way. He said no. He said the buyer was already interested and the papers were being drawn up. He said he was sorry. He said it like he meant it. Maybe he did. 62 days after Gerald died, Rainey walked out of the house she'd lived in for 35 years. She carried one suitcase. She'd packed it carefully the night before sitting on the bedroom floor and choosing what to bring from an entire life. Clothes, her reading glasses, a photo album with pictures of the children growing up, her marriage certificate, a small brass cross her mother had given her when she got married, a bar of soap, a comb, her notebook with the order numbers from the printing shop because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. The house was being shown to buyers the following week. Clayton had sent a man to change the locks. The man had arrived while Rainey was still packing. He waited outside smoking, checking his phone. He wouldn't look at her. When she came out with her suitcase, he went in and she heard the drill start before she'd even reached the end of the street. Rainey stood on the road outside her own home and didn't know which direction to walk. Left went into town, right went to the bus station, straight ahead went nowhere in particular. She picked left. She walked to the shelter. It was a concrete building on the edge of town with fluorescent lights and thin mattresses on metal cots. The woman at the front desk was kind but tired. She'd been doing this for years. She told Rainey she could stay for 2 weeks. After that, she'd need to reapply. There were rules. Curfew at 9, no alcohol, no visitors after 7, clean your own area, don't touch other people's things. Simple rules. The rules you make when 40 strangers are living in a room designed for 15. There were 40 women in the shelter. Some had been there for months, cycling through the 2-week stays, leaving for a day then reapplying. Some had children with them, little kids who played on the concrete floor and didn't seem to understand why they were there. One woman hadn't spoken in 3 days and sat in the corner holding a plastic bag with both hands. Nobody knew what was in the bag. Nobody asked. Rainey lay on her cot that first night and stared at the ceiling. The mattress smelled like disinfectant and something else she couldn't place. The fluorescent light buzzed. It never turned off. Someone 2 cots over was crying quiet and steady, the kind of crying that a person does when they have been doing it for so long it doesn't require any effort anymore. Someone else coughed. Somewhere near the back wall, a woman whispered a prayer. A child whimpered and then was quiet, soothed by a hand Rainey couldn't see in the dim light. She lay there and tried to understand what had happened. Not the facts of it. She knew the facts, the trust, the debts, the eviction. She tried to understand how a life that had seemed permanent, solid, fixed in place could dissolve in 62 days. How you could go from having a kitchen with a cracked tile and a husband who fell asleep in front of the television to lying on a cot in a room full of strangers. How the distance between those two realities could be so small. A piece of paper, a signature in a trust document, a man dying on a Tuesday morning. That's all it took. And Rainey thought about the cracked tile on her kitchen counter. She thought about the specific sound her front door made when it closed, that little click, and then the whoosh of the weather stripping she'd installed herself because Gerald said they didn't need it. She thought about the evening light that came through the west-facing window and made the whole room gold for about 20 minutes before sunset. All those details, all those tiny, ordinary details that nobody in the world cared about except her. Gone. Every one of them. Gone like they'd never existed. She stayed at the shelter for the full 2 weeks. Then she reapplied and got another week. Then they told her there was a waiting list and she'd have to find somewhere else for a while. Rainey took her suitcase and walked to the bus station. Not because she had somewhere to go, because the bus station had a bench and a roof over it, and she could sit there without anyone telling her to move. That's where the suitcase handle broke. That's the moment you saw at the very beginning. A woman on her knees gathering clothes, invisible to every person walking past. That was Lorraine Caldwell, 61 years old, a woman who had held a family together for 35 years, picking up her own underwear off a public sidewalk. For the next 6 days, Rainey drifted. There's no other word for it. She slept on benches. She washed her face in public bathrooms using the kind of thin liquid soap that comes out of dispensers mounted on tiled walls. She ate at a church that served free meals in the morning and evening, standing in line with dozens of other people who had nowhere else to eat. The food was simple, rice beans, sometimes a vegetable. The volunteers who served it were kind. They didn't look at you with pity. They looked at you the way you look at anyone who's hungry. They filled your plate and moved on. She carried her suitcase with a piece of rope tied around it because the handle was gone. The rope cut into her palm by midday and she'd have to switch hands. She learned things in those 6 days that she'd never known before. She learned that public bathrooms and bus stations lock at 10 at night and don't open until 5 in the morning. She learned that sleeping on a bench is not really sleeping. It's a series of shallow dozes interrupted by sounds, by cold, by the awareness that you're exposed. She learned that the worst part of being homeless isn't the hunger or the discomfort. It's the invisibility. She talked to almost nobody. People didn't look at her. She'd become the kind of person that other people's eyes just slid right over, like she was a crack in the sidewalk or a stain on the wall. Something you see but don't register. On the fourth day, Rainey took a bus, not to anywhere specific. She just got on the first bus that had an empty seat because the bus station had become unbearable and she needed to move. Sitting still was killing her. The bus went north. It stopped in small towns she'd never heard of. People got on and off carrying bags of vegetables, sacks of grain children. Rainey stayed in her seat and watched the landscape change from flat and dry to green and hilly. The air coming through the windows got cooler. She closed her eyes and for a few minutes she felt like she was going somewhere, even though she wasn't. On the sixth day, the bus reached the end of its route, a town called Birchwood. Rainey had never heard of it. The bus driver turned around and told her this was the last stop and she'd have to get off. She took her suitcase and stepped down onto a dirt road. Birchwood was tiny, a few shops with faded signs, a coffee shop with 3 plastic chairs out front, a post office that looked like it hadn't been used in years, a handful of houses scattered along the road, some occupied, some not. Beyond the houses, trees. Dense, thick old trees that climbed up a hillside and disappeared into the kind of green that you only see in places where people have stopped trying to control the landscape. Rainey walked to the coffee shop and sat down at one of the plastic chairs. She ordered a cup of coffee with the last of her cash. The man running the shop was old. His hands were steady and his face was weathered like leather left out in the sun. His name, she would learn later, was Earl Dawkins. He'd been running this shop for 40 years since his wife passed. He didn't talk much. Rainey sat and drank and tried to think of what to do next. She asked him if there was a shelter nearby. He shook his head. She asked if there was anywhere a person could stay for a night. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him making a decision. Then he pointed toward the trees. He said there was a path up the hill, about 20 minutes walk, maybe 25 if you went slow. At the end of it, there was an old cabin. Nobody had lived in it for years, decades maybe. Some local kids had gone up there once and come back saying it was full of junk and spiders and it smelled like wet wood. Nobody owned it as far as he knew, or if someone did, they'd long stopped caring. Earl gave her a small bag of sugar without charging for it. She thanked him. He waved her off. That was the extent of their relationship, and it was enough. Rainey finished her coffee. She looked at the trees. She looked at her broken suitcase. She looked at the road behind her, which led back to a world that had already forgotten her. And she started walking. The path was narrow and overgrown. Roots crossed it like veins under skin. Branches hung low enough that Rainey had to duck every few steps. Her suitcase caught on everything. Twice she had to stop and untangle the rope from a bush. The air changed as she climbed. It got cooler, damper. She could hear birds she didn't recognize and the faint sound of running water somewhere to her left. Her legs ached. Her lower back throbbed. She was 61 years old and hadn't walked uphill since a family trip to Shenandoah 15 years ago. But she kept going because there was no reason to go back. After about 25 minutes, the path opened up into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin sat at the far end of the clearing like something that had grown out of the ground rather than been built on it. It was small, one-story, built from wood that had gone gray with age and weather. The roof sagged in the middle but hadn't collapsed. One window was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The front door was closed but not locked. Weeds had grown up around the foundation so thick that the bottom third of the cabin was almost hidden. A rusted water pump stood a few feet to the right, its handle frozen in the up position. Behind the cabin, the hill continued upward into more trees and shadow. Rainey walked to the door and pushed it open. The hinges screamed. Inside, the air was thick and still and tasted like dust and old wood. Light came through the cracked window in a single gray beam. The floor was wood warped in places, but solid enough that it didn't give when she stepped on it. There was a table, a single chair, a wood stove with a pipe that went up through the ceiling. Against one wall, a narrow bed frame with no mattress, just bare springs sagging in the middle. Shelves lined the opposite wall, and on them sat glass jars with dried contents she couldn't identify. Tin canisters, a few books with swollen spines, a kerosene lamp with a cracked glass chimney, and a wooden box with a brass latch. Nobody had been here in a very long time. That was clear from the dust alone. Thick, gray, undisturbed dust on every surface. But here's what struck Rainey, and it's important. The place wasn't destroyed. It wasn't vandalized. It wasn't torn apart by weather or animals. It was just stopped. Like whoever lived here had walked out one day and everything had frozen in place. The jars still had dried contents in them. The books were swollen but still upright on the shelf. A pair of rubber boots sat by the door, cracked and gray with age. A coat hung on a nail behind the door, stiff as cardboard arms, hanging like it was still waiting for someone to put it on. One button was missing, the second from the top, and for some reason that detail hit Rainey harder than anything. A missing button. Someone had worn this coat. Someone had reached for it on cold mornings, buttoned it up, and walked outside into these woods. Someone real. She set her suitcase down on the floor. She stood in the middle of that cabin, alone in a town she'd never heard of, at the top of a hill she'd had no reason to climb. And for the first time in weeks, something in her chest loosened. Not joy, not relief exactly, just space. Room to breathe, room to stand without someone telling her when to leave. The silence here wasn't the hostile silence of a bus station bench at 2 a.m, where every shadow might be dangerous. This silence was patient. It had been here a long time. It could wait a little longer. She walked around the small room, touching things. The edge of the table, the back of the chair, the cold iron of the wood stove. She opened one of the jars on the shelf and sniffed it. Dried something, she couldn't tell what. She ran her hand along the books. Their spines were soft from moisture, but the pages were intact. She looked at the coat hanging behind the door with its missing button. She opened the cracked window wider and let the air move. The clearing smelled like wet earth and pine and something sweet she couldn't identify. Maybe flowers, or what was left of them growing wild along the foundation. She could hear the stream more clearly now, that gentle rushing sound, and the birds, and the trees moving in a breeze that was steady and cool and had no interest in her at all. It just blew. It had been blowing for years. It would blow long after she was gone. She sat down in the chair. It held her weight. She put her hands on the table and felt the grain of the wood under her palms. She looked around the cabin and made a decision on that felt less like a choice and more like arriving somewhere she'd been walking toward for weeks without knowing it. She was going to stay. That first night, Rainey didn't sleep well. The bed had no mattress, so she piled her clothes on the springs and lay on top of them. Every sound in the woods was amplified. Branches cracking. Something small and quick moving through dry leaves. The cabin creaked when the wind picked up, but it held. The cabin had been standing for decades through storms and winters and heat. One more night wasn't going to break it. In the morning, she started cleaning, not because she had a plan, because that's what Rainey did when everything else fell apart. When there was no solution and no path forward, she cleaned. She opened the door and both windows to let air move through. She swept the floor with a branch she pulled from a bush outside. She carried the jars off the shelves and set them in the grass to air out. She dusted the table with her shawl. She tested the water pump. After a dozen hard pumps that made her shoulders burn, brown bottle water sputtered out, then gradually ran clear and cold. It took her 3 days to make the cabin livable. She found a torn blanket in a trunk under the bed and washed it in the stream she'd heard from the path. She figured out the wood stove after 2 hours of cursing and 3 failed attempts. The pipe was clear enough to draw smoke, and she found a stack of dry wood behind the cabin, covered by a tarp that had mostly rotted away but had kept the center logs dry. She boiled water and drank it. She made rice that tasted like nothing but filled her stomach. She walked back down to Birchwood and spent her last few dollars on more rice salt, oil, and matches. Earl didn't ask questions. He just nodded when she came in. He gave her another small bag of sugar without charging for it. She thanked him. He waved her off. Over the next week, Rainey settled into a routine. Wake up, pump water, boil it, clean something, walk the perimeter of the clearing, sit in the chair and be still. She planted a few things in a patch of ground beside the cabin. Tomatoes, some herbs. She didn't know if she'd be here long enough to harvest them, but she planted them anyway. That's who she was, a woman who planted things even when she didn't know what was coming. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt still. Not happy, not safe exactly, just still. The kind of still that comes when you stop running and realize that at least for this moment, nothing is chasing you. The cabin was quiet. The woods were quiet. The stream made a sound like someone whispering in another room. Rainey closed her eyes each night and slept through until morning for the first time since Gerald died. Then she found the box. It happened on the 8th day. She was cleaning the shelves more thoroughly, taking down each item, wiping it, deciding whether to keep it or throw it away. Most of the jars were empty or held things too old to identify. The tin canisters were rusted shut. The books were salvageable, their pages intact despite the swollen spines. The wooden box with the brass latch was at the end of the shelf pushed toward the back. She'd noticed it on her first day but hadn't opened it. There had been more pressing things: water, fire, water, food, sleep. Now she lifted it down and set it on the table. The latch wasn't locked, just fastened. She opened it. Inside she found 3 things: a bundle of letters tied with twine. The paper was yellow and fragile. The handwriting was small and precise, written in English with careful penmanship. A photograph, black and white, curling at the edges, a little spotted with moisture damage. It showed a young woman standing in front of the cabin. She was maybe 30. Sharp eyes, dark hair pulled back from her face, and she was holding a notebook against her chest with both hands. Behind her, the cabin looked new. The wood was light, the roof was straight. The clearing around it was neat, maintained almost like a garden. Flowers grew along the front of the cabin in a careful row. And a document, heavy paper, official stamps, a red wax seal. It was a land deed, in the name of Winifred Callahan. For 10 acres of land that included the cabin, the clearing, the hillside going all the way down to where the path met the road, and a stretch of woodland to the east. 10 acres. Winifred Callahan hadn't just owned the cabin, she'd owned the entire hill. Rainey sat back in the chair and stared at the deed. She picked up the photograph again. Winifred Callahan. The name appeared everywhere now that she was looking for it. On the letters, on the inside cover of one of the books on the shelf, written in blue ink, carved into the underside of the table in small, neat letters. Winifred Callahan, 1973. This was Winifred's cabin. This was Winifred's life, preserved in dust and silence. Rainey read the letters one by one. They were from different people, different handwriting, different tones. Some were personal, warm, chatty letters from friends. One friend wrote, "You did it, Winnie. Your own place, your own land. Most women our age can't even imagine it." Some were from family worried. A sister wrote, "You can't live alone on a hill forever, Winnie. What will people say?" But there were other letters, 3 of them, no return address, typed on heavy paper with a company letterhead, Summit Ridge Development Corporation. They referenced a land survey and a reassessment of boundaries. They mentioned phrases like eminent domain consideration and fair compensation offer and development partnership opportunity. The tone of the first letter was polite, almost friendly. The second was firmer. The third, dated 1981, dropped the friendliness entirely. It ended with a single typed line. "This is our final communication on the matter. Please vacate the premises within 30 days. Rainey read that line 3 times. Please vacate the premises. She knew exactly what that felt like. She knew the weight of those words. She found one more document at the bottom of the box, an unmailed letter, addressed to someone named Constance, a sister it seemed based on the tone. The letter was dated November 1983. Rainey read it by the light of the kerosene lamp. Connie, I'm scared. Men have been coming to the cabin. Twice this week they stand in the clearing and watch. I've heard the county judge has been seen dining with Summit Ridge people. I've hidden copies of everything under the floor just in case. I'm not going to sell, and I'm not going to leave. But I'm not foolish. I know what these men are capable of. The letter was never sent. Rainey searched the box again. The shelf, the trunk under the bed. There was nothing else. No more letters, no more documents, no more trace of Winifred Callahan. Her story just stopped. Like someone had torn the last chapters out of a book and burned them. Rainey sat at the table for a long time. Outside, the clearing had gone dark. The birds had stopped. The only sound was the stream, that gentle rushing, and the wind in the trees. She looked at the photograph of the young woman standing in front of the cabin, sharp eyes, dark hair, holding a notebook against her chest. Winifred Callahan, a woman who'd saved for years to buy a piece of land, who'd built a cabin, who'd said no when powerful men told her to leave, and who'd vanished without a trace in late 1983, more than 40 years ago. Rainey looked around the cabin, the same walls, the same stove, the same table where Winnie had carved her name. If Winnie owned this land outright with a proper deed and official stamps, why was the cabin abandoned? If a development company had wanted her out, what had happened? Had she sold and simply left everything behind? Had she been forced? Where had she gone? The question sat heavy in the silence. Rainey folded the deed carefully and put it back in the box. She made rice on the wood stove. She ate it plain with a little salt and a pinch of the sugar Earl had given her. She drank boiled water from a cup she'd washed so many times the pattern had faded to a shadow. Then she lay down on her makeshift bed and listened to the trees outside. For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel still. She felt like she'd walked into the middle of something that had been waiting here buried in dust and silence for more than 40 years. And she had no idea what she was going to do about it. But she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't leaving. Not until she found out what happened to the woman whose cabin she was sleeping in. Not until she understood why Winifred Callahan had vanished from this hill and never come back. Outside, the wind picked up. The cabin creaked. The trees moved in the darkness. And somewhere down in Birchwood, Earl Dawkins was closing up his coffee shop and turning off the lights and not talking to anyone, which was exactly how he liked it. He'd lived in this town his entire life, 82 years. He remembered things most people had forgotten. And if Rainey had known what he remembered about the name Winifred Callahan, she would have walked down that hill right then in the dark to ask him. But she didn't know, not yet. The next morning, Rainey walked down the hill to Birchwood with the photograph in her pocket. She'd barely slept. The questions had kept her awake, turning over in her mind like stones in a tumbler. Who was Winifred Callahan? What happened to her? Why did the letter stop? Why did the cabin sit untouched for more than 40 years? The path down was easier than the path up. Her legs had grown stronger in the weeks she'd been climbing it. The rope around her suitcase had left calluses on her palms that were beginning to harden. Small changes. The kind of changes that happen when your body starts adapting to a life you didn't choose. Earl Dawkins was already at his coffee shop when she arrived. He was wiping down the counter with a rag that looked older than she was. 3 plastic chairs out front, same as always. A hand-painted sign above the door that said Earl's, and nothing else. She sat down at the counter and ordered coffee. He poured it without a word. Then she took out the photograph and laid it on the counter between them. Earl put down the rag. He looked at the photograph for a long time. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Something old and heavy shifted into place. "Where'd you find that?" he asked. "In the cabin," Rainey said. "In a wooden box on the shelf." Earl picked up the photograph. He held it carefully like it might crumble in his hands. He studied the young woman's face, her sharp eyes, the notebook pressed against her chest. "Winifred Callahan," he said. The name came out slow, like he was tasting it after a very long time. "You knew her." Everybody knew her. He set the photograph down and didn't pick up his rag again for 10 minutes. Then he told her everything. Winifred Callahan had been a fixture of Birchwood in the early 1970s. She taught children at a one-room school near the post office. The building was gone now, torn down in the 80s to make room for a parking lot that nobody used. Winnie was well-liked if a little unusual, single, independent, living alone on a hill when most women her age were married with children and grandchildren. She'd bought the land with money she'd saved over 10 years of teaching, 10 years of not buying new clothes when the old ones still fit, 10 years of not taking vacations, 10 years of not spending on anything she didn't absolutely need. She'd built the cabin with hired labor and her own hands, drove nails herself, painted the walls herself, planted a garden out front with flowers that bloom from spring through fall. She grew vegetables and brought them to the weekly market in town. She helped families with paperwork when they needed someone who could read legal English. She kept to herself but wasn't unfriendly, just private, just careful about who she let into her life. Then around 1979, Summit Ridge Development Corporation started buying land in the area. They were based out of the city, Charleston, Earl thought, or maybe somewhere in Virginia. They had plans for the region, big plans, a resort, luxury cabins, the kind of place where rich people from cities far away would pay good money to sleep near trees and pretend they were roughing it. Most people in the area sold willingly. The money was good, better than what the land was worth for farming or logging or anything else you could do with it. But Winnie wouldn't sell. Her 10 acres sat right in the middle of what Summit Ridge needed. Without it, their project had a hole, a gap they couldn't fill. They offered her more money. She refused. They offered her twice that. She refused. They sent letters, polite at first, then firm, then threatening. She still refused. Earl paused here. He looked at Rainey with old, steady eyes and chose his next words very carefully. One day, he said, sometime in late 1983, Winnie just wasn't there anymore. Nobody saw her leave. Nobody saw a vehicle come up the hill or go down. She was just gone. The school replaced her within a month, a young teacher from the county seat eager for the job. People talked about Winnie for a while, wondered where she'd gone, speculated, gossiped. Then they stopped talking. The cabin sat on the hill and nobody went up there. Nobody asked questions. Nobody filed reports. A single woman disappearing from a hill in a small rural town in the early 1980s didn't make anyone's list of priorities. And Summit Ridge acquired the land. Earl didn't know the details. Legal things, papers filed in offices. But by 1985, the deed was in their name. The land belonged to Summit Ridge Development Corporation. Rainey asked the question that had been burning in her since she'd read the letters. Did anyone report her missing? Did anyone look for her? Earl shook his head slowly. No family came asking, no police investigation, no inquiry. It was a different time, a different place. People disappeared. It happened. Rainey felt the weight of that settle over her. A woman saves for 10 years, builds her own home, refuses to be pushed off her land, and then she vanishes and nobody even asked where she went. One more thing, Earl said. He was looking at the photograph again, his weathered fingers resting on the edge. The man who ran Summit Ridge's operations around here, the one who came to town, talked to the local officials, oversaw all the land deals. His name was Dalton Mercer. He's still with them. Senior project manager now, from what I hear. Been with that company for more than 40 years. Rainey let that sink in. Dalton Mercer, the same man who'd been trying to get Winnie out more than 40 years ago, was still working for the same company today. She thanked Earl for the coffee and the information. She left money on the counter, even though he waved it away. Then she walked back up the hill, her mind churning with everything she'd learned. 3 days passed. Rainey went about her routine. Pump water, boil it, sweep the floor, walk to Birchwood for supplies, talk to Earl, walk back up the hill. She was waiting, though she didn't know what for. On the morning of the 4th day, she found out. She was boiling water on the wood stove when she heard something that didn't belong. An engine. Not the distant hum of a vehicle on the road far below. This was close. This was getting closer. She went to the window and looked out. A white SUV was grinding up the overgrown path branches, scraping along both sides, its undercarriage banging against rocks and roots. It stopped at the edge of the clearing. The engine idled for a moment. Then it shut off. 2 men got out. The first was young, maybe 30, wearing a hard hat and a high-visibility vest. He was carrying a clipboard and a rolled-up map. He looked around the clearing like he was measuring it with his eyes. The second man was older, maybe 55, gray suit that was already stained with mud at the hems. He had the posture of someone who was used to other people moving out of his way. He looked at the cabin the way you'd look at a wall that needed knocking down, like he was calculating the cost. They hadn't expected anyone to be here. That was immediately clear. The young man saw Rainey in the window and stopped mid-stride. He turned to the older man and said something she couldn't hear through the glass. The older man's face changed. It went from surprise to irritation in about 2 seconds flat. He walked to the door and knocked. Not gently. 3 hard raps that shook the frame. Rainey opened it. The man in the suit said his name was Dalton Mercer, Senior Project Manager with Summit Ridge Development Corporation. He said it casually, like it was the information he handed out to strangers all the time. But Rainey felt the name hit her like a slap. Dalton Mercer, the same man Earl had mentioned, the same man who'd been involved in Winnie's disappearance more than 40 years ago. And here he was, standing at the same door. Dalton looked past Rainey into the cabin. His eyes moved quickly, taking inventory. The table, the shelves, the wood stove. He asked who she was. She told him her name. He asked what she was doing here. She said she was living here. He asked since when. She said about 2 weeks. He nodded slowly. The kind of nod that comes from someone who isn't listening to the answer, but thinking about what they're going to say next. Then he spoke. The land this cabin stood on was owned by Summit Ridge Development Corporation. Had been since 1985. The cabin was an unauthorized structure on private property. He was here to conduct a survey for a new project. A resort, luxury ecotourism, the kind of place where people from big cities paid $500 a night to sleep near a tree and drink organic coffee and pretend they were roughing it, and he was going to have to ask her to leave. He said ask in a way that made it clear he wasn't asking. Rainey said nothing for a moment. She felt a familiar feeling. The same feeling she'd had when Clayton put the manila folder on her kitchen table. The feeling of the ground disappearing beneath her feet. But this time something else was there too. Something harder, sharper. She'd already fallen as far as a person could fall. There was nowhere lower to go. She asked him if he had documentation, proof of ownership, something she could look at. Dalton smiled, not a nice smile, the kind of smile that said he'd done this before with people who asked questions, and it always ended the same way. He said the documentation was with the company's legal department. She was welcome to contact them. He pulled a business card from his inside jacket pocket and held it out between 2 fingers. Rainey took the card. She looked at it. Then she looked at Dalton and said something that changed the entire shape of what happened next. I've seen the original deed. This land belongs to Winifred Callahan. Dalton's smile vanished. His face went flat, the kind of flat that covers a scramble happening behind the eyes. He stared at Rainey for 3 full seconds. Not a long time in most situations. A very long time when you're standing in a doorway looking at a man who just heard a name he wasn't supposed to hear. Then he turned to the young man with the clipboard, said something sharp and quiet, and they both got back in the SUV. The engine started. They reversed down the path without another word, and they were gone. Rainey stood in the doorway and felt her hands shaking. She didn't know why she'd said it. She hadn't planned to. It had come out the way truth sometimes does, without permission, at exactly the moment when a lie or a silence would have been easier. All she knew was this. The look on Dalton Mercer's face when she said Winifred Callahan's name was not the look of a man hearing that name for the first time. It was the look of a man who had heard it before, many times, and had hoped he would never hear it again. The next morning, Rainey took the bus to the county seat, 3 hours each way. She carried the original deed in a plastic bag tied to her body with the rope from her broken suitcase. She wasn't letting it out of her sight. The county records office was in a government building that smelled like old paper and floor wax, fluorescent lights, linoleum tiles. The kind of building that hadn't been updated since the 1970s and never would be. The clerk behind the counter was a young woman who looked bored and overworked. She was typing slowly on an old computer and didn't look up when Rainey approached. Rainey asked to see the transfer history for a specific property. She gave the legal description from Winnie's deed. The clerk sighed, took the information, and started typing. The computer was slow. Each page took 3 minutes to load. Then the clerk turned the screen toward Rainey and pointed. The transfer records showed that in 1984, the land had been declared abandoned property by the county magistrate's office. The owner, Winifred Callahan, was listed as whereabouts unknown, presumed relocated. The property was auctioned in 1985. The only bidder was Summit Ridge Development Corporation. They purchased 10 acres for a price so low it was almost insulting. Less than what you'd pay for a used car. Rainey asked the clerk a series of very specific questions. Was there any record of a search for Winifred Callahan number, any police report about a missing person, number any notification published in a newspaper, which was legally required under state law before declaring property abandoned? The clerk checked every file she could access. There was nothing. No police report, no newspaper notice, no evidence that any legally required step had been taken before the property was seized and auctioned. The declaration had been signed by a county magistrate named Raymond Whitmore. Rainey asked if Whitmore was still the magistrate. The clerk almost laughed. Whitmore had retired 20 years ago. He was living somewhere in the suburbs on a pension that the clerk said with a raised eyebrow seemed quite comfortable for a man who'd spent his career as a county-level government official. Rainey left the records office with copies of everything. She paid for them with money she'd saved by eating rice and beans for 2 weeks. She also left with something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Clear, sharp, focused purpose. Something was wrong here. Something had been wrong for more than 40 years. And by sheer accident, by losing everything and wandering blindly until she ended up at the end of a dirt path in a town nobody remembered she was the person who'd stumbled into the middle of it. She got back to Birchwood late that evening. The walk up to the cabin in the dark was terrifying. Every shadow looked like a person standing still. Every snapping twig was a footstep. But she made it. She wedged a piece of wood under the door handle, which was the only lock she had, and she started writing. Not a legal brief, not a formal complaint, just everything. In a notebook she'd bought at the county seat for $2. Every fact, every name, every date. She built the timeline on paper. Winnie's purchase in 1968, the Summit Ridge letters starting in 1979, Winnie's disappearance in late 1983, the fraudulent abandoned property declaration in 1984 with no newspaper notice, no police report, and a magistrate who retired suspiciously wealthy, the auction in 1985 with only one bidder, Dalton Mercer at the center of it all. Then and now. She wrote until the kerosene lamp sputtered. Then she sat in the dark and listened to the woods and thought about Winnie, a woman who'd saved for 10 years to buy a piece of land, who'd built a cabin with her own hands, who'd said no when powerful men told her to leave, and who'd vanished without a trace. 2 days passed. Rainey went about her routine, but she was watchful now. Every sound made her turn. Every movement in the trees caught her eye. Then she came back from Birchwood one afternoon and found the cabin had been searched. Nothing was taken. But the wooden box was in a different spot on the table. The letters inside were out of order. Someone had gone through everything. Looking for the deed. Rainey was sure of it. She'd been carrying it with her everywhere. It was still safe, pressed against her body under her clothes. But the violation of the cabin, the only space she had left in the world, made her stomach turn. The next day, Earl warned her. 2 strangers had come to town asking about her, who she was, how long she'd been there, whether she had family. Earl had told them nothing, but he looked at Rainey with worry in his old eyes. These are not small people, he said. You understand that, don't you? She understood. She just didn't care anymore. 3 nights later, Rainey woke to the smell of smoke. Thick smoke. Chemical smoke. The kind that doesn't come from a wood stove. She sat up and saw orange light through the window. The wood pile behind the cabin was burning. Someone had doused it with accelerant and lit it. Flames were already reaching toward the back wall of the cabin. Rainey grabbed her suitcase and the wooden box and ran outside. She pumped water until her arms screamed. She threw it at the back wall with everything she had. The old weather-dampened wood resisted the flames just enough. 20 minutes of desperate work. Alone, in the dark, with no one to help her. The woodpile burned out. The back wall was scorched and blackened but still standing. Rainey sat on the ground in front of the cabin, covered in ash and sweat, and shook. This was not a warning. This was an attempt to destroy evidence. To destroy her. She sat there until the sun came up. Then she walked down to Birchwood and used Earl's phone to call the police. A deputy came out. He was young and seemed uncomfortable. He wrote down what Rainey told him slowly in a small notebook. He said they'd look into it. The way he said it made clear that they wouldn't. But the report existed, on paper. That mattered. Rainey knew she needed help. Real help. The kind she couldn't provide for herself. But she also knew something else. She'd done the work. She'd gathered the evidence. She'd built the timeline. She'd faced Dalton Mercer herself and survived a fire meant to destroy her. She wasn't going to hand this over to someone else and hope they cared as much as she did. She was going to find people who would help her finish what she'd started. The County Legal Aid Society was a cramped office with a sign out front that needed painting and stacks of files on every surface. It was the kind of place that ran on coffee and stubbornness and not much else. Inside, a woman was sitting behind a desk, drinking tea from a paper cup and arguing with someone on the phone about a property dispute. Her name was Fern Whitaker. She was 38 years old. She'd been running legal aid for 6 years on a budget that would have embarrassed a lemonade stand. She handled cases for people who couldn't afford lawyers, farmers, widows, people who'd been cheated out of land they'd worked their whole lives. She was sharp, she was fast, she was underpaid, and she was exactly what Rainey needed. When Rainey laid out the documents on Fern's desk, every letter, every record, every copy she'd made at the county office, Fern went quiet. She read everything. 40 minutes. No interruptions. Then she looked up at Rainey and said 3 words. This is big. If the abandoned property declaration was made without the legally required steps, the entire transfer was void. The land still belonged to Winifred Callahan. If Winnie was dead, it would pass to legal heirs. If there were no heirs, other possibilities opened up. But the bigger question was darker. What had happened to Winnie? If she'd been forced out, that was a crime. And crimes connected to active fraud don't simply expire. Fern looked at the evidence Rainey had gathered. The timeline, the notes, the copies organized by date. You did half my job for me, Fern said. Where'd you learn to put together a case like this? I managed the books for my husband's printing business for 35 years, Rainey said. I know what a paper trail looks like, and I know when something's missing. Fern said she'd take the case. Pro bono. She said she'd been waiting for something like this. But Fern also made a call to a journalist. Garrett Holloway was 31 years old and worked for a regional newspaper called the Valley Herald. It had a small circulation but a serious reputation for investigative reporting. Garrett had been looking at Summit Ridge Development Corporation for over a year. He'd noticed a pattern in their land acquisitions across multiple counties. Properties that were always in rural areas, always owned by individuals rather than families or corporations, always acquired through auctions with single bidders at prices far below market value. He'd been trying to find a case where the original owner could be identified and the trail could be followed. Now he had one. Garrett came to Birchwood on a Wednesday. He was thin and intense. He carried a bag that was more camera and recorder than anything else. He sat in the cabin with Rainey and Fern for 4 hours. He read every document. He photographed everything. He recorded Earl's account of Winnie's disappearance word for word. He walked the property, measuring the clearing, noting the position of the cabin relative to the road below. When he was done, he looked at Rainey across the table. You know they're going to fight this, he said. She said she knew. And you know it might get worse before it gets better. She looked at the scorched back wall of the cabin, the black streaks where the fire had almost taken everything. It already got worse, she said. I'm still here. Garrett nodded slowly. There was something like respect in his eyes. Then let's finish it, he said. The discovery came 3 days later. Garrett was in the cabin going through everything one more time, looking for anything they might have missed. He was kneeling near the bed frame when he stopped. Have you looked under the floorboards? He asked. Rainey hadn't. She'd cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, but she hadn't thought to check beneath. Garrett pointed to a plank near the bed frame that was slightly shorter than the others. Its edge was worn smooth in a way that suggested it had been lifted many times. Rainey knelt down. She worked her fingers under the edge of the plank. It came up with a soft groan. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a metal box. She lifted it out. Her hands were shaking. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside were 3 things: a diary, leather-bound, the pages yellowed but intact. The handwriting was the same small, precise script from the letters. A second notarized copy of the land deed. and a letter addressed to Constance, dated November 1983. The same sister mentioned in the other letter, but this one was different. This one was never meant to be found. Rainey read it aloud. Her voice was steady, her hands were not. Connie, I'm writing this because I don't know what's going to happen. Men came to the cabin again last night. 3 of them this time. They didn't knock. They stood in the clearing and watched. One of them had a can of something. Gasoline, I think. They wanted me to see it. I've heard that Judge Whitmore has been meeting with Summit Ridge people, having dinner with them at the hotel in Charleston. I don't know what they've promised him, but I can guess. I'm hiding this letter and copies of everything under the floor. If something happens to me, I want someone to know the truth. I am not going to sell. I am not going to leave. But I am not foolish. I know what these men are capable of. If you're reading this, Connie, it means I didn't make it. Find someone who will listen. Don't let them get away with this. Your sister, always, Winnie. The cabin was silent when Rainey finished reading. Fern had her hand over her mouth. Garrett was recording, but his face was pale. Rainey set the letter down and opened the diary. It was worse. Months of entries. Months of escalating intimidation. Strangers appearing on the property at all hours. Winnie's garden destroyed overnight. The school principal taking her aside and telling her that certain people are unhappy. A dead animal left on her doorstep. Her mailbox smashed. A rock thrown through her window at 3 in the morning. The final entry was dated December 3rd, 1983. 2 men came to the door today. They didn't give names. One of them told me I have 48 hours. He didn't say 48 hours until what? He didn't have to. I don't know what they'll do, but I'm not leaving. I've worked too hard for this. I've given up too much. This is my home, the only one I've ever had that was truly mine. Nothing after that. The diary simply ended. Rainey closed it gently. She looked at the cabin around her, the same walls Winnie had looked at the night before she disappeared, the same window, the same door. More than 40 years of silence. And now finally someone was listening. Fern filed an expanded petition the following week. She alleged fraud, misconduct, criminal intimidation, the unexplained disappearance of a property owner. Summit Ridge's lawyers fought hard to dismiss it. They argued the transfer was decades old. They said Winnie had simply moved away. The statute of limitations they claimed had expired years ago, but the case had already gone beyond the courtroom. Garrett published his first article, front page of the Valley Herald, not just about Birchwood, about 3 other towns where Summit Ridge had done the same thing. Farmers who refused to sell and then vanished. Land declared abandoned without proper process. Single bidder auctions, a pattern stretching back decades. The story went regional. Then it went to television. Within 2 weeks, Summit Ridge Development Corporation was facing questions from journalists across the state. And Fern got a phone call that changed everything. It came from a woman in Portland, Oregon. Her name was Constance. She was 79 years old, and she was Winifred Callahan's sister. Constance had seen Garrett's article. She'd seen her sister's name in print for the first time in more than 40 years, and she had something to tell them. Something she'd kept secret for 5 years. Winnie was alive. Rainey was sitting at the table in the cabin when Fern called with the news. She had to ask Fern to repeat it 3 times. Winifred Callahan, 83 years old, was living in a commune in Vermont. She'd been there since early 1984, arriving in the dead of winter with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and a look in her eyes that the commune's director later described as the look of someone who has decided to stop existing. She'd given a false name. She'd worked in the kitchen, the garden, the laundry. She'd spoken to almost nobody for the first 5 years. Gradually, over decades, she'd built a small, silent life within the commune's walls. But she'd never left, never contacted her family, never gone back to Birchwood. She'd been in hiding for more than 40 years. Not because she'd wanted to disappear, because disappearing felt safer than the alternative. Constance had found out 5 years ago. A chain of coincidences involving a church donation list. She'd visited the commune in secret. She'd begged Winnie to come home. Winnie had refused. "They'll kill me this time," she'd said. "If I go back, they'll finish what they started." Constance had kept the secret until she saw Garrett's article, until she saw that a woman named Lorraine Caldwell had done what nobody else had done in more than 40 years. She'd gone to the cabin. She'd found the documents. She'd faced down Summit Ridge. She'd survived a fire meant to destroy the evidence, and she'd refused to leave. When Constance told Winnie about the article about Rainey, about everything that was happening, the old woman was quiet for a very long time. Then she said something she hadn't said in 4 decades. I want to go back. Rainey sat in the cabin and listened to Fern explain all of this over the phone. She didn't speak for a long time after Fern finished. Then she said, she's really alive after all this time. She's alive, Fern said, and she wants to talk to you. To me. She asked for you specifically. She said she wants to talk to the woman who did what she couldn't do. 2 days later, the phone at Earl's coffee shop rang. Rainey was there waiting. Fern had arranged the call. She picked up the receiver with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The voice on the other end was old, thin, but steady. Is this Lorraine? Yes, this is Rainey. A long pause. Rainey could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of someone gathering courage. My sister told me what you did. She told me you found the cabin, found my letters, found the deed. She told me you stood in the doorway and said my name to that man's face. I didn't know what else to do, Rainey said. I just said the truth. The truth. Winnie repeated the word like she was tasting it. I've been running from the truth for 40 years, hiding in a place where no one asked questions about your past, pretending I was someone else, trying to forget. Did it work? Another pause. Longer this time. No, not one day. I thought about that cabin every single day. I thought about my garden, my books, the flowers I planted along the front wall. I thought about standing in the clearing at sunset and watching the light come through the trees. I never stopped thinking about it. I just stopped believing I'd ever see it again. Rainey felt tears running down her face. She didn't wipe them away. What changed, she asked. Winnie said. You changed it. You walked into my cabin with nothing. You found what I'd hidden. You faced the same people who drove me away, and you didn't run. I had nowhere else to go. Neither did I. That's not why you stayed. You stayed because you're the kind of person who doesn't let go, who keeps fighting even when there's no reason to believe you'll win. Rainey was silent. She didn't know what to say. I've been afraid for 40 years, Winnie said. Afraid they'd find me. Afraid they'd finish what they started. But I watched the fear eat my life. I watched it take everything. And then I read about you and I thought there's a woman with nothing who's doing what I couldn't do. She paused. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of hiding. I'm 83 years old and I want to see my cabin again before I die. What are you saying? The voice on the other end of the line was clear now. Steady. No tremor. I'm saying I'm coming back. Tell them I'm coming back. Tell that lawyer. Tell that journalist. Tell the whole damn world if you have to. Winifred Callahan is coming home. The line went quiet. Rainey held the receiver against her ear for a long moment. Then she set it down and looked at Earl, who was watching her from behind the counter. Well, he said. Rainey wiped her face with the back of her hand. She's coming back, she said. After 40 years, she's coming back. Earl nodded slowly. Something shifted in his old face. Something that might have been satisfaction, or relief, or just the feeling that comes when a story that's been waiting a very long time finally gets to reach its end. Good, he said. About damn time. Rainey walked back up the hill that evening. The path was familiar now. She knew every route, every turn, every low-hanging branch. She reached the clearing as the sun was setting. The cabin stood there, same as always. Scorched back wall, sagging roof, weeds around the foundation. But it looked different now. It looked like something that was waiting to come back to life. Rainey sat down in the chair Winnie had left behind more than 40 years ago. She looked at the clearing, the trees, the sky turning orange and pink. She thought about the woman who had sat in the same chair watching the same sunset before men came in the night and took everything from her. And she thought about the phone call, about an 83-year-old woman in Vermont who had finally decided to stop hiding, who was finally coming home. Tomorrow there would be lawyers, journalists, legal filings, interviews. Tomorrow the fight would continue. But tonight, where Rainey sat in the chair and watched the light fade and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning, reaching for anything that might float. Real hope. The kind that comes when you realize that what you're doing matters, that the truth buried for 40 years was finally climbing out of the ground, that justice delayed for longer than most people live might finally be coming. The last light disappeared behind the hills. The stars came out one by one. And somewhere in Vermont, an 83-year-old woman was packing a bag for a trip she'd been avoiding for 4 decades. She was going home. Winifred Callahan came back to Birchwood on a morning in early spring. The air was cool and the sky was clear, and the hillside was that particular shade of green that only happens in the weeks right after winter finally lets go. Rainey had been waiting at the bottom of the path since 7 in the morning. She'd woken before dawn too nervous to sleep and had walked down the hill in the half-light, stumbling twice because she was thinking about what she was going to say and not paying attention to the roots on the path. She'd thought about this moment for weeks, rehearsed things in her head, formal greetings, expressions of admiration, reassurances that everything was going to be all right. Now she stood at the edge of the road where the path met the dirt lane that led into town, and she waited. The car arrived just after 9, a government sedan that Fern had arranged. Dark blue practical, the kind of car that officials drive when they want to look serious but not flashy. It pulled up slowly and stopped. The back door opened, and Winifred Callahan stepped out. She was smaller than Rainey had imagined. Thinner, 83 years old, and it showed in the careful way she moved, the deliberate placement of each foot on the ground. Her hair was completely white, pulled back from her face the way it had been in the photograph from 1973. Her hands trembled slightly as she steadied herself against the car door. She used a cane, a simple wooden one that looked like it had been with her for years. But her eyes were exactly the same as in the photograph. Sharp, watchful, taking in everything. She looked at the hill and the trees and the path going up, and she stood completely still. For a long time she didn't move. She just looked. Rainey could see something working behind those eyes. More than 40 years of distance collapsing into a single moment. The hill hadn't changed. The trees were taller, the path more overgrown. But the shape of the land was the same. It was still Winnie's hill. It had been waiting for her. Rainey walked over. All the things she'd rehearsed, all the careful words she'd prepared fell away the moment she stood in front of this woman and looked at her. She took Winnie's hand. It was cool and dry and surprisingly strong, and she said the only thing that came to mind. "The pump still works," Winnie laughed. A small dry sound, like a match striking, something sparking, something waking up after a very long sleep. She held Rainey's hand and didn't let go, and they walked up the path together. Slowly, stopping every few yards so Winnie could catch her breath. The climb was hard for her, but she refused to hurry, and she refused to stop for long. She touched trees along the way, running her fingers along bark that had been thin saplings when she'd last been here. She stopped at one point and pointed to a stone at the edge of the path that had a mark scratched into it. "I made that in 1970, she said, "a trail marker, in case I ever got lost in the dark." "Did you ever need it?" "No, but I made it anyway." They kept climbing. When they reached the clearing and Winnie saw the cabin, she stopped walking entirely. The scorched back wall still dark from the fire. The sagging roof that Rainey had been propping up with a timber brace. The weeds. The cracked window that still hadn't been replaced. And the garden Rainey had started. Tomato plants, herbs, a row of marigolds that were just beginning to bud along the front of the cabin. It was not the cabin Winnie had left. "Smaller than I remembered," she said quietly, and sadder. More than 40 years of neglect had taken their toll, but it was standing. After the men and the threats and the kerosene and the fire and the fraudulent papers and the 40 years of silence, it was standing. The walls were solid, the door still closed, the chimney still drew smoke. And someone, a stranger, a woman who had walked up the hill with a broken suitcase and nothing left to lose, had lit the stove and cleaned the floor and planted flowers. Winnie looked at Rainey with an expression that Rainey would think about for the rest of her life. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was recognition. The look of one woman seeing another woman who understood what it meant to have everything taken away and to still be standing. "You fixed the stove," Winnie said. "First thing," Rainey said. They went inside. Winnie sat at the table and ran her hands over the wood, feeling the grain, finding the spot where she'd carved her name more than half a century ago. She traced the letters with her finger and didn't say anything. Rainey made tea on the wood stove. The kettle whistled. She poured 2 cups. They drank in silence. Outside the clearing was bright with morning light. The trees moved in a gentle breeze. A bird was calling from somewhere in the canopy. The same kind of bird Rainey had been hearing since her first night here. After a long time, Winnie spoke. Not to the lawyer, not to the journalist. To Rainey, she told her everything. The night in December 1983, 3 men kicking in the cabin door at 2 in the morning. The cold, the darkness, the sound of wood splintering. Before she could get out of bed, 2 of them were inside. One grabbed her arm. The other picked up the kerosene lamp, the same lamp Rainey had been reading by every evening, and held it close to the wall. He tilted it slightly. A thin line of kerosene ran down the wood. "This place burns easy," he said. The 3rd man stood in the doorway. She couldn't see his face. He was the one who did the talking. He told her she had 2 choices. Leave now, or leave later in a way that would be much worse. He didn't use the word kill. He didn't need to. They drove her to a bus station 2 towns away. They left her there with $20 and the clothes she'd been sleeping in. No shoes, no coat. The temperature was near freezing. It was 2 in the morning. She sat on a concrete bench until the first bus came at 5. She got on it. She didn't look at where it was going. She rode until it stopped. Then she got on another one. She ended up in Vermont because she'd heard there were communes there, places where people could arrive with nothing and be taken in. And that's what she did. She arrived with nothing, and she disappeared for more than 40 years. She'd lived with the weight of it every day, built a new life small and silent in a place where no one asked questions about your past. She meditated, she worked with her hands, she read books and tended gardens and served meals to strangers. But she'd never forgotten the cabin. Not one day. She'd never stopped being angry. She'd just been too afraid to find out what had happened to her, land her books, her garden, the flowers she'd planted along the front wall. Too afraid until Rainey. "You did what I couldn't do," Winnie said. "You found the cabin, you found the documents. You stood in the doorway and said my name to that man's face. You survived a fire meant to destroy you. And you didn't run." "I had nowhere else to go," Rainey said. "That's not why you stayed." Winnie's eyes were steady, clear. "You stayed because you're the kind of person who doesn't let go, who keeps fighting even when there's no reason to believe you'll win." Rainey didn't know what to do, so she poured more tea. And they sat together in the cabin that had been waiting for both of them in different ways for a very long time. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. Rainey became the organizing center of everything. 35 years of managing books and records and orders for a printing shop had given her skills she'd never realized she had. Skills that finally had a purpose beyond keeping someone else's business running. She created a system, every piece of evidence numbered, every document cross-referenced, every date and name and location cataloged in a master notebook that grew thicker by the day. When Fern needed a document, Rainey knew exactly where it was. When Garrett needed to confirm a date, Rainey had it ready. When the lawyers asked questions, Rainey had answers. She'd spent her whole life keeping things organized for other people. Now she was doing it for justice. Fern filed the expanded petition. Fraud, misconduct, criminal intimidation, the unlawful seizure of property, the unexplained disappearance of a property owner. Summit Ridge's lawyers fought hard. They filed motion after motion. They argued the transfer was decades old. They claimed Winnie had simply moved away. They cited statute of limitations. They questioned the authenticity of the documents. Every motion was denied. The judge assigned to the case a woman named Eleanor Hartwell, who'd been on the bench for 22 years, read the diary entries in her chambers. She read the unmailed letter. She looked at the timeline Rainey had constructed, and she let the case proceed. Garrett published his investigative series, not just about Birchwood, about 3 other towns where Summit Ridge had done the same thing. Farmers who refused to sell and then vanished. Land declared abandoned without proper process. Single bidder auctions at prices that insulted the intelligence of anyone who looked at them. A pattern stretching back decades. The story went regional. Then it went national. Television crews showed up in Birchwood. Reporters stood in front of Earl's coffee shop and talked about land fraud and corporate corruption and a woman who'd been in hiding for more than 40 years. Summit Ridge's stock price dropped. Their board of directors issued a statement expressing concern, and still Winnie waited. The day Winifred Callahan walked into the courtroom was something people in that county would talk about for years afterward. The gallery was packed. Garrett's articles had made the case famous. There were reporters from 3 national papers, a camera crew from a television station, and about 100 local residents from Birchwood and the surrounding villages. Some of them remembered Winnie. Most didn't, but they all knew the story now. She was small, thin, her hair was completely white. She used a cane. She moved slowly, but she walked in under her own power. She refused the arm that the court usher offered, and she sat down in the witness chair with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Summit Ridge's legal team, 3 lawyers in expensive suits from a firm in the city, watched her sit down. Their lead counsel, a man named Harrison, adjusted his tie. He'd been briefed on the situation. He knew the case was going badly. But he also knew that cross-examining an 83-year-old woman who'd been kidnapped from her home was a losing proposition no matter what she said. Judge Hartwell asked Winnie to tell her story in her own words, at her own pace. Winnie spoke for 45 minutes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry Bowie. She described buying the land, 10 years of saving every penny from a teacher's salary, not buying new clothes when the old ones still fit, not taking vacations, not spending on anything she didn't absolutely need. She described building the cabin, the satisfaction of driving nails with her own hands, the feeling of standing in the clearing at sunset and knowing that everything she could see belonged to her. She described the years of teaching, the children she'd helped, the families she'd served, the life she'd built, small and quiet and entirely her own. Then she described the letters from Summit Ridge, the strangers appearing on her property, the escalation, her garden destroyed overnight, dead animals left on her doorstep, the school principal taking her aside and telling her that certain people are unhappy. She described the night the 3 men came, the kicked door, the kerosene on the wall, the drive to the bus station, the $20, no shoes, no coat, the 40 years of silence. When she finished, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ceiling fan turning. Summit Ridge's lawyer Harrison stood up. He straightened his papers. He asked Winnie one question. If this really happened, the way you described, why didn't you go to the police? Winnie looked at him. She didn't look angry. She didn't look intimidated. She looked at him the way you'd look at someone who'd asked why water was wet. And she said in a voice that was steady and clear and had more than 40 years of waiting behind it, because the police were with them, the judge was with them, the land office was with them. Everyone who was supposed to protect me was being paid by the people who wanted my land. Where exactly was I supposed to go? Harrison sat down. He had no follow-up questions. The judge ruled 8 days later. The ruling was 27 pages long. It methodically dismantled every element of the 1984 property transfer. The land was never legally abandoned because Winifred Callahan had never left voluntarily. The newspaper notice required by law was never published. The police search required by law was never conducted. The auction was conducted with a single bidder at a price that the judge called so far below market value as to constitute evidence of collusion on its face. The 1984 transfer was declared void. The land was restored to Winifred Callahan. Summit Ridge Development Corporation was ordered to pay damages, back taxes on the property they'd been holding illegally for 40 years. All legal costs, the criminal aspects of the case, the intimidation, the forced removal, the fraudulent property declaration, the magistrate's collusion were referred to the state prosecutor's office for criminal investigation. Dalton Mercer was arrested 2 days after the ruling. He was at the airport trying to board a flight to Mexico when federal marshals stopped him at the gate. The charges were criminal intimidation, conspiracy to commit fraud, arson for the fire at the cabin, and abetment of wrongful confinement. He was 67 years old. He'd been with Summit Ridge for more than 40 years. He'd overseen land acquisitions in 7 counties. He'd built a career on making problems disappear. Now he was the problem. Raymond Whitmore, the retired magistrate who'd signed the fraudulent abandonment declaration, lost his pension and was charged with misconduct and fraud. 2 other former county officials who had processed the paperwork were convicted of facilitating fraudulent land transfers. A 4th was being investigated. The state government ordered a comprehensive review of all abandoned property declarations in the region, going back 30 years. Fern was appointed to the review committee, and 4 other victims from other counties came forward after reading Garrett's articles. In one case, an 80-year-old farmer who'd been told his land was seized for government purposes in 1991 discovered it had actually been sold to Summit Ridge through the same fraudulent process. He got his land back. In another case, the grandchildren of a woman who'd relocated in 1987 filed a criminal complaint. The pattern that had persisted for decades quietly in small towns where nobody was watching was finally breaking apart. One afternoon, about a month after the ruling, Winnie sat across from Rainey at the table in the cabin. The same table where Winnie had carved her name in 1973. The same table where Rainey had spread out all the documents and built the timeline that had brought everything to light. Winnie had something to say. She wanted to give Rainey 5 of the 10 acres. The cabin, the clearing, the path down to the road. She said it simply like she was offering a cup of tea. Not sell, give. This land, she said, had been stolen once. She wasn't going to let it become something people fought over again. She wanted it in the hands of someone who would take care of it. Someone who understood what it was worth. Not the money. The other thing. The thing that couldn't be put on a deed or a balance sheet. The fact that it was a place. A real place. A place where a person could stand and say, I am here, this is mine. Nobody is going to take it from me. Rainey said she couldn't accept. It was too much. She didn't deserve it. Winnie looked at her with those sharp, steady eyes. I didn't ask if you deserved it, she said quietly. I said I'm giving it to you. There's a difference. And that was the end of that conversation. Fern drew up the papers. Rainey signed them at the table. The same table where Winnie had carved her name more than 50 years ago. Winnie signed as the grantor. Earl Dawkins climbed the hill to serve as a witness. He signed his name slowly and carefully the way a man does when he wants to make sure every letter is right. Then he asked if there was any more tea. With the settlement money from Summit Ridge, Rainey did something she'd never imagined doing. She started a foundation, the Callahan Caldwell Fund. Its purpose was simple: to help women who'd lost their homes through legal fraud, unfair family trusts, or land seizure. Women like Winnie, women like herself. She used the skills she'd built over 35 years of managing someone else's business to build something of her own, something larger than herself. Fern helped with the legal structure. Garrett wrote about it, bringing attention and donations. The story of the foundation became part of the larger story, the woman who'd lost everything and found a cabin and uncovered a 40-year crime and then built something to help others. The first case the fund helped was a 58-year-old widow in the next county. She'd lost her land after her husband died. A paperwork error, she'd been told, a technicality, nothing to be done. But the paperwork error turned out to be organized fraud. The same pattern, different names. She got her land back. The cabin got a new roof in December. Rainey did most of the work herself, standing on a ladder in the cold morning air, hammering nails, fitting beams, sweating through 3 layers of clothing. A carpenter from Birchwood named Remy did the parts that required skills she didn't have. He was patient and didn't talk much, which suited Rainey fine. Earl came up the hill to help and turned out to be remarkably strong for 82. He held boards steady past tools and offered commentary on the weather that nobody asked for, but everyone listened to anyway. Winnie watched from a chair in the clearing, wrapped in a shawl, giving instructions that nobody followed, but everyone pretended to consider. 3 women and 2 old men rebuilding something that had been broken for a very long time. The new roof was solid. The new back wall replaced the scorched wood from the fire. The new window was real glass, clear and whole, not cracked and patched with tape. Colleen sent money. This time it was enough. Enough for a real mattress that Rainey carried up the hill on her back because the path was too narrow for a cart. By the time she got it to the top, she was laughing so hard at the absurdity of the situation that she had to sit down in the clearing and catch her breath. A 61-year-old woman carrying a mattress up a mountain. A year ago, she'd been kneeling on a sidewalk, picking up her underwear. Now she was building a life. Mitchell came to visit with his wife and the baby 2 weeks before Christmas. He'd taken 3 days off work, the most he'd ever taken. He carried the baby in a sling up the hill and arrived red-faced and sweating. His wife followed behind, stepping carefully on the roots and rocks, looking around at the trees with an expression Rainey couldn't quite read. They walked into the cabin. Mitchell looked around. The wood stove, the shelves of books, the table, the new window. The photograph of Winnie as a young woman now framed and hanging on the wall. He sat down and was quiet for a long time. His wife stood in the doorway bouncing the baby, looking at the clearing and the trees and the sky. Then Mitchell said, "Mom, this place is actually really nice." Rainey told him to wait for sunset. When it came, the evening light through the west-facing window turned the whole room gold for about 20 minutes. Mitchell stood there holding his baby and watching the light, not saying anything. And Rainey knew he understood. It was the same light, the same golden quality she'd had in the west-facing window of her old house in Millbrook. Different window, different walls, different life. Same light. As if the sun had followed her here and found a way to give her back the one thing she'd missed most. Spring came, the clearing filled with green. The path from Birchwood got a little wider from daily use. Rainey walked it every day. She'd stopped carrying the suitcase months ago. She'd unpacked it. The rope was gone. The clothes were in a wooden trunk that Earl had carried up the hill. The photo album sat on the shelf next to Winnie's books. The brass cross her mother had given her stood on the windowsill where the morning light hit it and made it glow. Winnie stayed in the cabin through the winter and into spring. Her sister Constance came from Portland and stayed for a month. She was 79 and had bad knees and couldn't climb the path without stopping 4 times. But she made the climb every morning because she wasn't going to let a hill keep her from her sister. 3 women in a cabin designed for one. They slept on makeshift beds. They bumped into each other in the small kitchen area. They argued about how to arrange the shelves and whether the table should go against the wall or in the center. It didn't feel crowded. It felt like a home. One morning, Rainey stood at the cabin door and looked out at everything. The tomatoes coming in, the marigolds blooming bright orange and gold against the gray wood, the pump handle catching sunlight, the path winding down through the trees to a town that had started to feel like hers. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, kneeling on a sidewalk, picking up clothes with shaking hands, invisible to every person walking past. She thought about the cracked tile on her old kitchen counter, the specific sound her front door made when it closed, the evening light through the west-facing window. She thought about how she'd believed for 35 years that her life was that house, that kitchen, that tile, that without those things, she was nothing. She'd been wrong, completely wrong. Her life wasn't the house. It wasn't the kitchen. It wasn't the tile. Her life was what she did when all of that was taken away. It was the walk up the hill, the hand on the pump, the words she'd said to a man in a gray suit who thought he could scare her. It was the notebook full of facts that brought a 40-year crime into the light. It was the chair at the table where 2 women drank tea and didn't need to explain anything to each other because they'd both survived the same kind of storm. It was the foundation that would help women like her, like Winnie, like the ones who would come after. The cabin stood behind her, solid, scarred, repaired, still standing, just like her. Rainey picked up her cup of tea. She walked outside. She sat down in the chair that Winnie had placed in the clearing facing east, so you could watch the morning light come over the ridge. She drank her tea. The morning was cool. The birds were loud. Somewhere down the hill, Earl was opening his coffee shop and boiling water and not talking to anyone, which was exactly how he liked it. Winnie was still asleep inside, breathing slowly and steadily, the way she'd learned to breathe in the commune during all those years of hiding. Constance was making noise in the small kitchen, probably looking for the sugar that Rainey kept in a different place than she expected. Normal sounds, morning sounds, the sounds of a life. Rainey sat in the clearing and watched the light change on the trees. She thought about Gerald, dead now for more than a year. She thought about the house in Millbrook that belonged to someone else now. She thought about Clayton in the manila folder and the way the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She didn't feel angry anymore. She didn't feel sad. She felt something else, something she didn't have a word for. The feeling you get when you've walked through fire and come out the other side and realize that you're still here, that you're still you, that the things you thought defined you, the house, the marriage, the kitchen with the cracked tile, were never really you at all. You were always something else, something that couldn't be taken away, something that only becomes visible when everything else is stripped back. She'd spent 35 years holding things together for other people, managing books and schedules and meals and holidays. making sure everyone had what they needed, pouring coffee for people who never poured coffee for her. She thought that was her life, but it wasn't. Her life was this moment, this clearing, this cup of tea in her hands, this cabin that had survived fire and neglect in 40 years of silence, this hill that had been waiting for someone to climb it. This woman, 62 years old now, sitting in a chair and watching the sun come up over the ridge. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't nothing. She was Lorraine Caldwell. People called her Rainey. She'd lost everything and found something better. Not easier, not simpler, not the life she'd planned, but hers. Truly hers. For the first time in 62 years. The sun cleared the ridge and the light changed, going from orange to gold to white. The birds got louder. A squirrel ran across the clearing and up a tree, chattering at nothing in particular. Rainey finished her tea. She stood up. She looked at the cabin one more time. The new roof, the new wall, the window that actually closed properly now. Then she turned and started walking down the path to Birchwood. Earl would have coffee ready. He always did. And tomorrow there would be another morning. And another one after that. And she'd be here for all of them.